Every church has an answer to this question. Almost none of them agree. Some say the Bible clearly permits women to preach, and point to Deborah, Priscilla, Junia, and Philip's 4 daughters. Others say the Bible clearly restricts it, and point to one specific verse from Paul that seems to settle the matter completely. But here's what almost nobody explains. The Greek word in that verse, the one everything hinges on, appears exactly once in the entire New Testament. Just once. Which means translators had almost no other biblical text to compare it against when they decided what it meant. That single word has been translated 17 different ways across different Bible versions. And which translation your church uses determines everything they teach about women and preaching. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that word is, what it actually means, and why 2,000 years of careful readers have landed in completely different places. No agenda, no denomination, just the text. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, subscribe now. This channel does one every week. Let's start with what the complementarian position, the view that restricts women from preaching, actually rests on. Because it doesn't rest on dozens of verses. It rests primarily on 1 Timothy 2:12. Paul writes, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man." That's the verse. That's the foundation of the entire restriction argument. But look at what Paul actually wrote in Greek. The word translated exercise authority is authentine, pronounced othentane. And here's the problem. Authentine appears nowhere else in the New Testament. Not once. It's what scholars call a hapax legomenon, a word that occurs only one time, which makes it extremely difficult to pin down its precise meaning. Outside the New Testament, in other Greek literature from the same period, authentine carries a surprisingly negative range of meanings. It's sometimes meant to domineer, to act with violence, to usurp, to murder. Some scholars argue Paul chose this specific word, rather than the ordinary Greek word for authority, exousia, which he uses 26 other times, precisely because he was describing a specific, abusive kind of authority, not authority in general. If that's right, if authentine means to domineer or usurp rather than simply to lead, then Paul wasn't saying women can't teach. He was saying women can't domineer or usurp leadership, which is a completely different restriction. Others push back strongly on this. They argue the negative connotations of authentine come from texts that are too old or too obscure to apply here, and that in Paul's own time the word simply meant to have authority, full stop. Under this reading, Paul's restriction is clear and straightforward. Women are not to teach or hold authority over men in the church. Both of these are serious, scholarly positions, and which one you find more convincing will determine almost everything else you believe about this topic. If you want the actual text behind debates like this instead of just being handed a conclusion, that's what this channel does every week. Subscribe if you haven't, and turn on notifications, because next week we're going somewhere in the original Hebrew that I think will genuinely surprise you. Now here's where most teaching on this topic stops, because 1 Timothy 2 is not the only voice in the New Testament on women and ministry. Paul himself, writing to the Corinthian church, acknowledges that women pray and prophesy in public worship, and rather than stopping them, gives them instructions on how to do it appropriately. In Acts 21, Philip's 4 daughters are described as prophesying. In Romans 16, Paul calls Junia a woman, outstanding among the apostles. In Acts 18, Priscilla, named before her husband Aquila in most manuscripts, teaches the great Apollos more accurately about the faith. The egalitarian position, the view that permits women to preach, doesn't ignore 1 Timothy 2. It places it in context. Paul was writing to a specific church in Ephesus, which had specific problems with false teaching. The restriction under this reading was situational, addressing a specific crisis in a specific congregation, rather than a universal rule for all churches for all time. The complementarian position responds. Paul grounds his restriction not in Ephesian culture, but in creation order, in Adam being formed first, in Eve being deceived. That grounding in Genesis, they argue, makes it universal, not situational. So here's where the real disagreement actually lives. not in whether the Bible has something to say about women and authority. It clearly does. The disagreement is about three specific questions. First, what does authentine actually mean, general authority, or a specific kind of abusive, usurping authority? Second, was Paul's instruction to Timothy a universal rule for all churches, or a specific response to a specific situation in Ephesus? Third, how do you weigh Paul's apparent restriction in 1 Timothy against the women? The New Testament clearly shows operating in significant ministry roles. Priscilla, Junia, Deborah, the 4 daughters of Philip. None of these questions have easy answers. And that's not a weakness of Scripture. It's an honest reflection of what the text actually gives you when you read all of it carefully, in its original language, without deciding the answer before you start reading. So here's where it actually lands. One Greek word, authentine, used exactly once, with a disputed meaning, in a letter to a specific church with specific problems, surrounded by a broader New Testament pattern of women operating in significant ministry roles. 2,000 years of careful readers have looked at exactly the same evidence and landed in different places, not because they're ignoring the text, but because they're taking it seriously enough to wrestle with what it doesn't fully resolve. No agenda here, just what's actually written. If this gave you something clearer than what you walked in with, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which position your church holds and whether this changed how you think about it. I read every one.